Hello, welcome to Revive and Rise. I'm your host, Melody Parrish, and I want to thank you for joining us today. We have a very special guest, Emmanuel Blanchard, and I would just like to thank you, Emmanuel, for coming to visit us today. And let's start the conversation.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Great, great. So, with it being African American History Month, we're um, we're having time to share stories and anything that you may have experienced in your life that is about racism and trauma. So, what experiences have you had?
Oh, we're starting off hot here. um, well, I would start by saying that I come into this experience as a Black person from a very unique perspective. My parents emigrated to this country in the late 1970s from the Caribbean, and I was born here in the States, and so I think that's a very unique experience to move into a country and not necessarily have the native African American experience, but to have the Black immigrant experience, and then to feel the experiences of being Black in the United States. So one of my first experiences of racism would happen to be when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I wasn't aware of it, but it wasn't until years later that it kind of dawned on me, like, oh, that's an
Mhm.
example of how racism presents itself. My parents worked very hard. They believed in the American dream. That's why they left home. And we moved to the suburbs. And upon moving into the suburbs, we were one of the first Black families on our particular block. And in the neighborhood, both of our neighbors immediately put up for sale signs. Um, and this was a largely Italian, Irish, German neighborhood, and clearly we stood out. I have three older siblings, and my parents worked very hard for us to have this experience. But this was one of the first experiences where I realized, like, oh, I'm not necessarily welcomed in every space.
Mhm.
Um, and I'll just dovetail that one particular experience with a more concrete example of systemic racism.
Mhm.
When many years later, as an adult, and I was trying to rent an apartment in New York City, I experienced housing discrimination, which is a form of racism,
Mhm.
where it I had to jump through hoops and hurdles to be able to find the better apartments, even though I had the financial requirements, I have the educational requirements, and really we should just be able to stop at financial requirements to live in a certain neighborhood. But I experienced housing discrimination. So from the very beginning of my life and my childhood
Mhm.
to my adulthood, experiencing many forms of discrimination and many forms of racism that shape those forms of discrimination, it's run the gamut. And I could go on and on, but like those are the two examples I use to really describe my experience, one in childhood and another
Mhm.
version of it in adulthood.
Oh, I see. So yeah, can you give us more of the perspective coming from the African American male perspective? Wait. Where are you from originally?
So I'm born in New York City. My family
Mhm.
is from Haiti.
Haiti. Okay. So yeah, how would you explain how do you compare the immigrant black experience versus the experience being a black American?
It's a very, very different experience. It's one where like one of the things that I have to deal with is I have to navigate multiple identities
Mhm.
because I am Haitian American, but I'm Black, and people just they assume I'm African American. The experiences are very different. So one of the things I tell my classes is that as a Black person who comes from a predominantly Black country, um, impoverished but nevertheless Black,
Mhm.
is I've always had a history of Black leaders, Black doctors, Black attorneys, Black engineers, Black school teachers. Um, Whereas if you're African American, November 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, that was the first and only head of state who was a person of color, short of Kamala Harris being vice president of the United States. from 2020 to 2024, or 2021 to 2025 rather. Um, that's a very different experience. And I think one of the things, and we will probably spend some more time talking about this, is that there are nuances in the Black experience that sometimes many people just don't understand. So um, my dad's experience as being a Black man in the United States is very different than my experiences as being a Black man in the United States. One, because he was able to be part of a more insular society, whereas I have to be in multiple rooms, multiple spaces. Many times I'm the only Black person in a room, whereas that's not necessarily the experience, the lived experience my dad has had. So his version of what racism has looked like, whether it be not being able to buy houses in every neighborhood, versus my experience not only not being able to buy houses in every single spot that I would like to buy, but also experiencing microaggressions at work. Also
Mhm.
having to deal with when people see my name on an application, the assumption that I'm a DEI hire, or the assumption that I somehow didn't receive my position because of hard work or my intelligence. There are so many nuances to it. And I'll just add one more thing.
Mhm.
Um, when you are an immigrant, uh, and when my family came, and I can just go on and on for days about this, my family came during the beginnings of the AIDS crisis. So there was an othering that happened, that although we were Black, there was a othering to the Black immigrant experience. So this is such a complex and nuanced experience that it really is rich for conversation and exploration.
Yes, yes. And so when you're talking about like the different experiences between like Black immigrants, Black immigrants per country, and then the different African American experiences, I guess, on social levels. Um, can you talk more? Can you compare and contrast those experiences for our listeners?
Absolutely, absolutely. For many West Indian immigrants, I mean, you can even boil down the Black experience to like three very, very large headings. You have the African American Black experience for those who've had ancestors who can tie their history to the slavery of the United States. Then you can have those who are part of the Caribbean diaspora. So whether you're talking about people who immigrated from Haiti or Jamaica, you can talk about people who have family who are part of it. This is where it gets really complex.
Mhm.
Other islands in the Caribbean. So you might be talking about other Latin American groups who can then sort of choose a more nuanced identity. So, for example, there are Afro Latinos, Afro Latinas,
Mhm.
Afro Latinx members. So, people, for example, who might be Dominican, but who
Mhm.
might present as Black people in the United States. So, this is where it gets a lot more complex. Or people who are Puerto Rican, but
Mhm.
who present as Black,
Mhm.
um, but who, because of their last names or because they might speak Spanish, that might make it more nuanced. And then another label, another group are people who are from Africa. So, for example, the sons and daughters of those who are from Nigeria or Ghana or South African, um,
Mhm.
they are African in America. And within the Black experience, many of us are well aware of these differences, these the similarities that we have, that we present as Black, but we're also aware of the many cultural differences that exist here for us in the United States.
Mhm.
So one of the things, for example, that I've had this conversation with many of my friends who embody all of these different experiences that I enumerated is, what is the proper title for us?
Mhm.
For someone who is from Africa in the United States, are they more African American than someone whose family can tie their history to 200, 250 years being here in the United States? So even the labeling
Mhm.
is a complex, um, difficult subject matter for us to broach and to make sense of it, because the label has not always existed. The African American moniker has not always existed. Um, and also too, like, your ties to history are very different.
Mhm.
So, for example, if you are African American, you have a history that's more tied to the history of this country. Whereas for a person like myself, I'm bicultural. where I have a history that's tied to the Caribbean, but I also have now a history tied to the United States. And so I'm kind of pulled in two separate directions.
Mm.
And the same is true for those who are African in America, where they have a history that's tied to Nigeria and Ghana and Botswana, and Sudan and Congo, but they also now have a history that's tied to here. So it
Mhm.
is a very layered, it's a very nuanced range. One of the things I love telling my students is that Black isn't monolithic. Black is a very, very rich and diverse experience. It's a very different grouping. And even like, for me, like I have to I learn about Blackness all the time as well, too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one thing that people don't understand. People think that you're just Black,
Yeah.
but there's not these different layers. Or
Mhm.
people think, oh, you're just Hispanic, but
Yeah.
you don't really think about being in different countries, different social structures, and like you say, being bicultural, right? So can you tell us more about being a
Mm,
Black male versus what you have heard? You said you have siblings. Do you have sisters?
I do have two older sisters and an older brother. And
And
we've
do
had this
they,
conversation. Yeah.
oh, good, good. If you don't mind sharing, whatever you feel comfortable.
It's funny because I'm working on research in this specific topic as we speak, and I have a presentation on this in about a month. Um, the Black male experience is very different than the Black female experience. Um, you know, the I was literally having this conversation with my research partner, who's a Black woman, also
Mhm.
whose family is from the Caribbean, and she was sharing how one of the more difficult aspects of being a Black woman is that she's viewed as a threat the moment she disagrees. Whereas for me, in certain spaces, because I'm a male, there is that level of privilege. There is that level of privilege that, being a man in many spaces affords for me. For example, I work in education, which is a heavily dominated by women. I work in K-12 education. It's heavily dominated by women. And so the assumption, for example, is because I'm a man, well, at some point you have to become a school leader because, that's what men do in this space. And so in that regard, as being a Black man, there are some advantages. However, some of the drawbacks of being a Black man in professional spaces is I stick out. I will always, always stick out. I will always be viewed as the enforcer. I will always be viewed as the scary Black man. So, like, oftentimes because I also teach in predominantly white spaces,
Mhm.
um, I'm viewed as the scary, strict teacher
Mhm.
versus being a teacher with standards or
Oh.
being a good teacher. So there are some assumptions that do come with my Blackness and my male identity as well too. I have to always be, and this is the reality. So I'm just going to put this out here. I always have to be well spoken because there are associations with, for example, being less educated, and I've confronted this
Mhm.
in my career. Um, I've had to confront, parents who've been aggressive
Mhm.
towards me because of this idea of, well, he's a Black man, he might be more threatening, and so because of the possibility he might be more threatening, I have to approach him in an aggressive fashion. And this is something that we see for many people of color, for many Black people in
Mhm.
particular. The thought of you being threatening is the constant. The threat of the Black man is a constant. Um, and so this has really been my experience in my professional life for the past 20 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And and it's just interesting that you talk about the gender differences because everybody has, the stereotype of the angry Black woman,
Yes, yes.
right? And it's so strange to me because even people like you say, you have to be well spoken. I had a friend on a couple weeks ago that was in the corporate world, And he said he always had to make sure that he spoke well. And then when he was going back, like to his family, to his neighborhood, then they would ask him why he was speaking white.
Yep.
And so it's just so interesting
Code
that
switching.
you guys say that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a reality. I'll share this with you, Melody. I had an experience my first year teaching in a specific school, and I had spent the summer working with children who were just like me, and I was switching languages. I'm a fan of hip hop. I grew
Mhm.
up in the hip hop generation, growing up listening to Notorious B.I.G. Um, but when I got to this particular position, I wish someone a happy birthday, because in AAVE, in African American vernacular, you don't use the TH, you just say the F. So you skip that diphthong. And this particular former colleague of mine, called me out on it. And I became well aware of it. And in that moment, I was very young and I was very new to like microaggressions in the professional space. So I didn't have the courage at the particular time to call that person out on it,
Mhm.
because that individual himself had a very prominent accent that wasn't the standard New England anchor accent that is supposed to be used in academia. But I remember my blackness being called out at that very moment based upon my language. And it's in that moment that I realized that, oh, I have to be aware of there are certain expectations and there are certain microaggressions that I will face in certain spaces that I'm in. Um, Case in point, I've had to lead with my academic pedigree. I've had to lead with the fact that I am Ivy League educated. I had to lead the fact that I went to private schools, because the assumption is that I'm not an equal to my white counterparts. When I fought for equity in hiring practices, the line I'm almost always met with, that is a dominant line today when people talk about DEI, is, well, we only want to hire the best. Why is the presumption that hiring in a diverse fashion reduces the quality of hiring? Because the de facto means is that if it's white, then it's always the best hire. And so it's those things that, when we talk about like the struggles, like the internal turmoil that a person of color, particularly Black employees, face, these are some of the things that a lot of institutions either ignore. They either know, or if they do know it, they ignore it because it is an inconvenient truth.
Right, right. And, I was reading Ta-Nehisi Coates,
Mm.
Between the World and Me, and he was talking about how he grew up and he always had to give double, to try double. And are you saying that same experience happened to you?
So absolutely. Um, it's something that uh, I teach in the suburbs of Long Island, and with every Black educator that I've encountered, every Black educator that I've known, there's always more expected of you, and
Mhm.
institutions can't admit that. Institutions cannot admit that there are biases in hiring practices. It's uncomfortable to admit that. It's uncomfortable for a structure or an institution or an HR department or a hiring committee to admit that there are separate requirements, and that when it comes to Black hires, that there's more expected of the Black hire.
Mhm.
One of the things I call out in some of the stuff that I do in my own educational consulting work is helping institutions of education to realize that there are implicit biases, and that it doesn't make you a bad person, but you do bear a certain weight if you choose to ignore the implicit biases. So, why is it that Black hires will get ignored by certain HR firms? Why is it that when we look at certain names, we're like, oh, that probably is a person who won't have, here's the dirty word, for example, in hiring, cultural fit. That's a term that, how many times have applications been denied simply because the perception of a name will lead to this idea of this person won't be the best fit. Here's another example of it, and then I know we have other questions to get to. How many nepotistic hires take place in different industries, for example, in education, simply because you know a person because it's more convenient. And that becomes a mask for not admitting that we do actually have implicit biases in our hiring practices that disadvantage people of color, particularly Black employees or prospective employees.
Oh, yeah. When I was fresh out of college, um, I had a friend that went to nursing school, and she was an African American. And once she graduated, she put in an application, and because she had an ethnic first name, it was denied. And
Mhm.
then she said, hmm. So she put in the exact same resume and application and just put in a white name, and she got accepted and called in for interview. And it just goes to show, like you say, that bias is unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so you're talking about the microaggressions. I've some of the guests that I've had on this month have talked about being in white spaces and just not realizing that um, these microaggressions are even happening to them. And can you tell our audience, do you just get used to it, or what do you feel? How do you feel about that?
Um, I think that there are lots of layers to microaggressions.
Mhm.
And I'm fortunate enough to be doing my doctoral work examining some of these ideas and experiences and giving language to them. I think one of the things that your previous guest might have faced is there's a generational element to this. I'm of the generation that did not quite have the language to call out the behaviors. Uh, I had an experience where I was part of an experience where someone was being hired in a school district, and it was a Black woman, and she's younger than I am, and she was very clear in demanding certain terms before she was hired. She wanted to meet with members of the BIPOC community. She wanted to have conversations with those individuals. And the reason why that stood out to me is because that's generational. She's a younger millennial. She's a younger millennial at the time, and she's part of a group of Black professionals that were given a lot more language to be able to call out certain behaviors. So if you're part of Gen X, if you're part of older Gen X or younger Gen X, which is what I'm part of, um, it might have been more difficult for me earlier in my career to call out certain microaggressions or to even know what it was or even to know what to do with it. I'm now at the point in my career where thankfully I have the ability to see it. I have the ability not only to see it, but to name it and to also be able to explain how is it happening. So I do think that this is something that there might be a tide that's shifting, but at the same time, the optimist in me is then confronted with the pessimist in me because there are explicit efforts being made through larger political forces to dismantle the structures that are helping Black students deal with this, Black employees deal with this. It isn't coincidental for me that there are overtures and clear implicit executive orders that are being written to dismantle DEI initiatives. It isn't. It doesn't. It doesn't. It isn't beyond my comprehension why certain states have moved to dismantle critical race theory. It isn't. These things are intentional, and this is why certain groups have experiences that they can't quite articulate. Once you remove the language, it enables the behaviors to persist.
That's true. Like, I don't know. I was listening to someone on a podcast, and they were talking about how, you know, no one wants to be called racist,
Hmm.
but, that's what it is. And it's like nobody wants to admit when things happen, or these microaggressions, but we need to name that. And like you're talking about finding the language to do that, how important is that? And how can we, as listeners and as allies, help with that?
Mm, it's an amazing question. I'm gonna I'm gonna give you something that I teach in my class that's really really fascinating. The word the term racism and racist is an early 20th century construct. It's an early 20th century term. Um, I think the term racist was found in literature for the first time in popular usage in around the year 1901 or 1902, which means things like the Atlantic slave trade, the word racist could not be attached to it. It wouldn't be until after the fact when historians are writing or rewriting the history of the Atlantic slave trade that they could finally, by the early 1900s, start to attach the word racist to the practice. Even if there were those like William Wilberforce who were saying that the structure is wrong, this is something that's wrong by the mid 19th century, but the word racist or racism wasn't around until after the fact. Language, and so the reason why I'm saying this is because language is critically important for empowering those who are struggling. Um, Again, I truly believe this, and I'm a history student. I was a history major in college. Um, One of the things that powerful forces do to empower themselves is that they intentionally strip certain terms and certain language away from oppressed people. They intentionally do that. And so one of the things that's being done right now is that terms like racist, terms like DEI, terms like CRT, terms like woke are being either stripped of their power or they're being reversed in terms of their intentional meaning. So, for example, the term woke has been intentionally weaponized. The term CRT, this was a master class, and I'm forgetting the gentleman's name who did this, but he intentionally took something CRT, which it isn't divisive, but he intentionally manipulated the meaning of it as to lessen the power of it. So CRT initially, all it was prior to its weaponization was a frame by which law students understood the passage and the writing of laws. This was never something that was taught on the K through 12 level. Never. It was a grad school way of looking at the composition of laws. This one individual comes along, shifts the meaning of it to dismantle an entire way of looking at structures. It's insidious, but it's brilliant. And so, for those who want to ally with Black people and those who want to ally with oppressed peoples, it's important that anytime you encounter someone who's using a term incorrectly, you have to correct them. For example, I have a major issue with the term reverse racism because racism is rooted in not just prejudice. People of all colors can be prejudiced, but there's something about the power that's connected within the idea of racism. There's power behind it. It's power plus prejudice. So when we look at economic structures, if people are participating in economic structures that oppress people, that's where you see racism. When you see laws that are being passed that benefit people, yes, that's racist. When you see people who are able to buy homes because of segregated laws or laws that create segregation, or real estate agents who are participating in de facto segregation, that's racist because you're participating in a structure based upon prejudice and also utilizing power. So those who are allies have to have the ability to call that out and to say, that's what that is.
I see. I see. Yeah, because something that I find disturbing now, you're talking about DEI, and that's like the big hot topic right now. And I find it so fascinating and it's so heartbreaking at the same time that people have to that the thing that people say is that DEI just is not about the color of someone's skin, it's about these other things. That may be true, but why to get support for something, do you have to say it's not just about the color
Yeah,
of someone's skin? Do
yeah.
you get what I'm saying?
I do get what you're saying. It's fundamentally rooted in anti-blackness.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's like I get the language thing that you're talking about.
yeah.
Definitely.
Can I hit that point that you just raised?
Yes.
And it's a really important point. It is a point of frustration of mine that um, it's in part because the history of racism, the history of structural racism and institutional racism are so deep and entrenched in the history of this country that anything that attempts to reveal the truth of the history of how institutional racism and structural racism presented itself, manifested itself, and continues to be perpetuated, it makes certain people uncomfortable. And so as a result, this is why there's such a strong effort to, I mean, Toni Morrison, there are efforts in states like Florida that have succeeded to ban literature that talks about this. There are clear efforts to silence educators who teach about the Tulsa massacre. And why is that? Well, in part because it requires Americans to face very difficult truths. And those truths, they fly in the face of American exceptionalism. They fly in the face of this idea of we need to continually work to create a more perfect union. And that's the irony of it. As someone who loves history, who teaches history, it amazes me how many people refuse to accept the ethos of the founders that there's a work to be done to continually create a more perfect union. That it isn't perfect, but that there's a need to continually work, continually to franchise, to enfranchise people, to give them greater rights. But to your point from earlier, I think that there's something about the history of Black people in this country that really makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. And I'll finish with this thought really quickly. Um, the history of Black people in this country is very fascinating, where we love what Black people produce, but we don't necessarily love the truth of what helped to produce those things. So, for example, our society loves Black art. We love jazz. We love the blues. We love country music. We love hip hop. I mean, hip hop is the number one form of music today, as of right now. But we don't like the truths that or help to produce those forms of art. We don't want to talk about that. We just want we just want the byproduct of it. We don't want what actually caused it. We don't want to confront that. And that's what's disingenuous, and that's what's really difficult in this moment.
Yeah. It's just so frustrating sometimes because it's like you take a couple steps forward, but then you take so many steps back. And I think so much about this slogan, "Make America Great Again." Like, what in the world? I don't know. My my grandfather, he always said that everybody would talk about the good old days, from back, and he said, but I don't know what was so good about them,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know. And can you speak on this? I mean,
yeah.
because being an African American, you have to. It has to really have an effect on you mentally when that people say that, "Make America Great Again," and you're like, it's great right now. Why do we have to go back?
I I approach it. I approach it as a history person, And Trumpism makes perfect sense. Trumpism is a byproduct of one of the things, like, so a lot of my work, I'm asked these questions about, like, these difficult moments that we're in right now, these existential crises that we face in terms of like the survivability of democracy. I have to teach this. I have to teach this in real time as well too. And one of the things that I say about Trumpism is that it is the culmination of many unresolved issues that we as a society have never confronted. Um, for example, I ask my students this all the time, and it's really a thought exercise. When exactly did we perfectly solve the issue of racism? And I've asked this question a million times, because really rooted in a lot of the anti-DEI, a lot of the anti-CRT, a lot of the, let's stop woke, is this idea of, well, we're all Americans. We don't we people will paraphrase Dr. King and say, well, we're now evaluating people upon the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Um, and then I always ask the question, well, okay, so when was the exact moment did we systematically root out racism? And then the second question I always ask is, how did we do it? And that's when you start to ask those questions, it reveals that many people don't have an answer. And it's in part because I think there's something cultural that we have, this inability to confront very painful truth. And so I think the MAGA movement really, what it does is that it kind of simplifies very complex realities. So, for example, um, the history part of me that removes my blackness for a second, looks at MAGAism, and it's like, well, part of it is born out of this fear of economic insecurity, the idea that the economy has changed in the past 50 years, 60 years, and it's just easier to blame migrants, Asian people, Black people for an economy that's changed. It's much easier rather than to simply say, well, there's automation, there's globalization, there's rising inflation. No one wants to hear that. No one wants to hear complex truths when easier oversimplifications that can tie to unresolved things like unresolved racism are easier answers. So for me as a Black person who works and teaches in academia, it is difficult because I do think that there are ways in which MAGAism is a byproduct of just things that we refuse to address. We refuse to address systematic oppression. We refuse to address um, investments in education. We refuse to look at what is the individual's role in preserving democracy. It's why, like, in terms of moving towards more of a tyranny, Americans are more and more willing to surrender their rights because it's like this idea of, I'm just going to outsource the preservation of democracy to someone who says that they'll do it, and not understanding, no, you actually have a responsibility to be an active participant in a democracy. So MAGAism makes perfect sense. I'm not a supporter of it at all, but it it makes sense. Someone will save me instead of me saving myself.
Right, right. Yeah, and that brings me to another point, kind of with it, but not. But you hear all the time, well, if people just work harder, they can get out of such bad situations. And I hear white people a lot say, well, I had to work really hard to do this. I had to, I didn't grow up poor. I don't understand what this white privilege is. And you just and then you get people that say, well, if they'll just pick themselves up from their bootstraps and everything, but People, I think, don't understand that our systems are made to oppress
Mhm.
people and made to just hold people down, and you can't just do that. Can you
Yeah.
explain that to our listeners, that
Oh,
sometimes
yeah.
you just work yourself out of things?
Um, I'll give a quick example. Where you're born determines so much of your lot in life. Your zip code, your zip code. Um, there are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There have been dozens of studies done on this, that your zip code will often determine the arc of your life. For example, I work in public education. Your local public school has a lot to do with how far you'll go academically. Even before an individual, a child is conscious of what kind of decisions they can make, the kinds of teachers that they have, the level of education that their teachers will have, the quality of the school building that that kid will encounter, access to high quality online services will already be determined. So that child who's 4 years old, 5 years old, before they enter into a school building, their zip code will often determine whether or not that child will become either a high school graduate or someone who's in prison. So is that really a choice that a child has, to have teachers who might be less prepared, more burnt out, facilities that are lacking as compared to suburban schools? Can that child actually conceivably pull themselves up by their bootstraps, to use that idiomatic expression, the same way as a child born in the suburbs who can afford tutors, who's being shuttled back and forth to different extracurricular activities, who's being given personal one-to-one devices, whose parents went to college or beyond? Now, you might say, well, okay, well, that's not a race issue, that's a class issue. Well, remember what I said before. There are many structures that create de facto segregation. And so many people will say, well, people like to live where other people are just like them. Ask real estate agents about that. Ask people who lived in the town of Levittown, Long Island, were written into many of the housing idea that you could not sell to Black prospective buyers. And that forms of de facto segregation still exist today. So the idea, this myth that we have that the individual can do it alone and that they're choosing to live in an impoverished state, it's something that we tell ourselves to feel better about not having to be active in confronting things like systemic injustice. And I think that's the honest truth. I think that's the piece when people are asked. So, like, one of the things I like to ask people all the time is, what have you done to confront systematic racism? Or what is one thing that you know that someone in your family has done? So, if you believe that you live in a post racial society, tell me something that someone in your family did in a preceding generation they did to fight systemic justice. What did they do? What exactly did they do?
Mm.
And that's what's missing, is that we don't necessarily have. I'll give another example. If we are in a post-racial society, does your school reflect that? Does your curriculum reflect that? Do you actually have the ability to engage in open conversation with a person like myself? Or are you going to run away from the conversation? Because we're really in a post-racial society, and you shouldn't have an issue discussing the history of race with a person like myself. And what I found is that often people are unwilling to have the conversation, in part because it reflects the honesty or the truth of where they actually are. They're not equipped to have the conversation because, in fact, that they know there are still a plethora of issues that confront us with regards to issue of racism.
Yeah, I think so. And in the book Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi brings up a good point that I had never thought of. Um, he was talking about the American dream, and then he said, if you go back, it says we the people, but who is the we? And, a lot of people just don't think about that. Who is the we in America? And you have this American dream, but is that really good for everybody? It can be different for everybody, but still be a good thing if people are allowed the opportunity.
Mm. Yeah, I see it all the time. One of the things that I talk about, and actually I'm looking at my version of between the world of me, between the world and me. Um, One of the things I think about all the time is the idea that the American dream can be reached alone is farcical. It's such a farce. Um, there is an imperative. There's this social imperative. There's a social demand that we are responsible to one another. When I teach, I'm not just teaching for a paycheck. Whatever level I'm teaching on, whether it's a graduate level, whether it's teaching on the high school level, I'm responsible for the betterment of my students. There's a social contract there. That's how you get to the American dream. I think what's happened is, the more, and this is like my Judeo-Christian values showing here for a second. I do believe that we have a responsibility to one another. We have a greater responsibility for one another. Just from that very lens, the idea that we can discard a person simply based upon their skin color and say, I'm not responsible to see that that person does better is evident that there's a greater issue. I teach in a predominantly white institution. I challenge my students not because they're white students and they're entitled to a quality education. No, I teach them and I have high standards because I expect them to. That's my responsibility as an educator. But it's also the responsibility of a banker to distribute loans out equitably. It's also responsibility of police officers to police equitably. Um, one of the challenges I gave to some of my former students was that when Eric Garner was killed in, the 2010s, he was killed for being non-compliant in the face of a misdemeanor, or likely it just amassed to be a minor misdemeanor. Minor misdemeanor. Would he have been policed the same way if he were in a suburb and a white man? So I say all of that to say it does not get better until we kind of pull back from this idea of being hyper individualistic. And if we really believe in we the people, who, like you asked the question before, who really are the people? Are you only talking about people who look like you? Are you only talking about people who are part of your family? Are you only talking about people who are part of your segregated community? If that's what people mean by we the people, then you don't really mean we the people, you just mean me. and you don't really believe in this moniker of the United States. You really don't believe in it. You really believe in your local, tribal, very perverted understanding of the United States.
Yeah, because I feel like things in this country have gotten so individualistic, like you
Mhm.
say. We've gotten so out of community and out of relying on each other. So why would you say that's happened, or what's your thoughts about why that's happened?
That's a really good question. I don't, I have my theories on this. I think that one of the things that has exacerbated it is obviously we can go to social media. I think that there's this idea of um, really the inability for us to confront and to really continue to build this idea of community. I think that it's a really difficult question to answer. I don't know what's led to this continued hyper individualism. I do believe. Um, I forget who wrote this book, but there's a book that I always cite, and the name is escaping me right now. Um, but in the book, one of the things that the author talks about, and I'm going to remember in a second, he talks about how there's always been this spirit of individualism in the United States since the days of the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims decided in 1620 that they were going to leave England because they didn't want to be part of community and they wanted to establish their own separate self. Um, and even when we get to the revolution, there still is this idea of, well, we worked with this for this common goal to establish, freedom, but we're not quite sure post-revolution if we want to be one nation or we want to be 13 separate independent kingdoms. I do think to a certain extent that level of individualism has been part and parcel of the history of this nation. Um, I also do think that, and now that I have more of a formula, an idea of how to answer this question, I also do think that the reluctance of those in power to enfranchise oppressed groups allowed for there to be more of a spirit of individualism as well. When you look at the arc of U.S. history, the fact that like you look at this in the Asian American history, there's an Asian American movement, there's a Native American movement, there's been a Black civil rights movement, there's been waves of feminism, there's been waves of the LGBTQ plus movement, and there's been this slow like, well, we don't really want to give power to this group. It creates these elements of individualism. Um, and so I do think that part of it, not to be Marxist in any way, shape, or form, there is this continued thread of fighting for power and for resources. And so I do think that that's part of the arc of our history. And the more that people refuse to share and what's really abundant, the more it creates this crisis of individuals.
Yeah, because I just look, I've been to several different countries across the world, and I've just noticed going there, it's just so beautiful how the people interact and how
Mm.
warm they are with each other, how welcoming they are with each other. And then I come back here and I'm like, I don't even know my neighbors. I don't,
Yeah.
you never interact. And even as a child, I knew everybody in my neighborhood and everything. I just don't know how things got to that level to where I can live in a building of like 40 individuals and not know a single one,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
but what you
It,
say does make sense.
yeah. It's there's no I just think that there's really no we've increasingly gotten to the point where there's not necessarily we don't view that there's a benefit to being part of community. And I think that the structures that support community, like for example, I see this in schools where instead of focusing on school as a community, in some schools has become more of commodity. It's not what can I give to the school community, it's what can I get out of the school community. And I think this has become something that's been true of almost every structure that we have in place. And so if this has really become us culture, like, so what can I take from government, for example? Like, what can I get out of government? I think this is one of the things we're seeing with the present administration is that you have to ask the question, is this an administration that is looking to give or to be in service to people, or to be an administration that is looking to take from people? Almost every institution you can think of becomes something that I'm only taking from it and I have nothing to offer it. I think that really undergirds this idea of individualism, because then what becomes the common meeting place where we're here to all give to something? I think that's pretty much dead now. Is that we've become a hyper consumerist society where there isn't a place where we meet and we say, okay, I'm not going to take, I'm going to actually give in this particular space. And we've all agreed to this. We're all going to give to this space as opposed to me taking from
That's true. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Wow. Well, I could talk forever
it.
about this. And it's so interesting talking to you. It's just fascinating. Um, so I thank you, but can you leave our listeners with any afterthoughts that you may have?
Oh wow! Well, first off, thank you so much, Melody, for having me on. This was an amazing conversation. Um, some of the questions I've had an opportunity to really to do this a few times, and this is one of the most thought-provoking conversations I've had myself. So um, I had to actually stop and think, and like, oh, that's a really challenging question. So I really appreciate that. I really appreciate the opportunity for this. If I were to leave your listeners with something that's thought provoking, um, it's one of the adages I tell my students all of the time. We not only study history, we make history. To me, that is one of the most important things that I've been blessed to ever process and download and to say to people is that you're not only someone who's looking back, but in your existence right now, you actively have a possibility to create history. Um, I am a Black man, but you are as responsible for ensuring my survival as I am ensuring your survival. I'm going to work hard to help people who are oppressed, but you have a responsibility as well. Um, and the more people we have working to ensure that all groups, all oppressed groups, are protected, the better it is that we will have as a society. The more productive society we'll have, the safer society we'll have, the more prosperous of a society we'll have. And the last thing that I say to people all the time is, can you call yourself a good person if you see someone suffering and you do nothing?
Yes, yes, because there's this great big um, pull religiously. It seems like to this cult. I call it a cult
I do too. I do
of
too.
of people that are just so harmful to individuals, and you're
Yeah.
like, how is that any kind of religion? I just don't understand. So I like that you say that. How can you call yourself a good person when you see people around you hurting?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Emmanuel, and I really appreciate it. And feel free to come back anytime.
Got it. I will definitely be back. And thank you so much again.
All right. And everyone, just remember that you don't have to suffer alone. So have a wonderful day. And thank you for listening.